here today representing Ken Lay, who's on leave and taking some leave before the fire season starts. So you're stuck with me today, but hopefully I'll certainly be able to make some pertinent remarks, and certainly I bring with me Ken's best wishes and hope that you get a lot out of the day. Look, today, the timing of today's conference is interesting as well, because of course yesterday we had White Ribbon Day and we're wearing our white ribbons, and Steve and I participated in the march yesterday to try and bring attention to the issue of violence against women. And I know the family violence connectivity is one that's very real for this group, and I know our keynote speaker Elaine's had a long history looking at the connectivity between natural disasters and family violence, which of course is quite real. Certainly in Victoria, where we have, I think it's 1 in 7 Australians will experience a natural disaster, and 1 in 3 Australians, particularly women, will experience family violence and violence in the home. Usually women at the hands of a man that is either their partner or current or former partner. And so those numbers are really high, so the proportion of Australians affected by both those two issues is significant, and therefore it's always prudent when we to look at the issues around the overlap between those two phenomena. And I know that's something that this conference has done extensively up to today, and obviously including today. And today you're also looking at the experience of men in relation to natural disasters, particularly in the aftermath of natural disasters. Certainly in relation to the connectivity between those issues, the main causation of violence against women has been the exercise of power. And whilst there's a number of enablers that cause that exercise of power, at its very source, violence against women stems from usually a man wanting to exercise physical power over a woman over whom they are more physically able to exercise that power over. And we need to look at the causation of why that occurs. And natural disasters is one area, and an important area, that leads to the stresses that become enablers for men to choose to exercise that power, because it is a choice that a man makes to be violent against a woman. And when they make that choice, there are all sorts of factors and stresses that will be on that male when he makes that choice. Natural disasters play a key part and can play a key part in causing that stress. Of course, in times of natural disaster, a man goes through, and a woman for that matter, but in terms of the male response, they go through a range of emotional factors that play on them and then acts on their psychology. Obviously there's the initial trauma of the event, and then often the loss of people they know, the loss of lives, the loss of loved ones. Quite often in a natural disaster is something that has a very sense of immediate loss, and that's that immediate impact. But then there's also the sense of the recovery. So there'll often be economic hardship caused by natural disaster, and as we know in Victoria with the Black Saturday bushfires and floods, we know full well the stress that comes from the economic hardship that's caused by natural disaster. That plays on the psychology of a male, because the male is somehow expected, and there seems to be a psychological expectation of the male being the stoic one and the one who has to provide and has a sense of a paternal guardianship over a family unit. And that places a stress, often a self-imposed stress, but nonetheless a stress over that male to be the one who's in control and the one who's able to handle and manage the family unit recovery from a natural disaster. Also, I think in Australia, and you probably find this in the US as well, I guess, but the geographic isolation of disaster is something that plays heavily, I think, on the male psychology as well, where a lot of countries in the world, there's obviously density of population, the density in relation to support services and networks available. The isolation of the Australian continent, I think, makes it particularly difficult in a country like Australia for that recovery to occur in a more seamless fashion. And obviously that does a lot in terms of placing stress on a family unit and placing stress on the male in the family as well. I know from my own experience in terms of the Bali bombings, I was tasked in 2002 to head up the international assistance team at the Bali bombings. And the Bali bombings, whilst wasn't a natural disaster, it was a man-made disaster. But often, along with man-made disasters, you get the initial physical scarring of the landscape, as you do a natural disaster, but what actually lasts is the emotional scars on the landscape, and that is the emotional scarring that occurs to everyone that's involved. And certainly with the Bali bombings, when we were trying to map our initial response to that event, we were thinking at that time, this is 11 years ago, we do things better now, but back then we were thinking through, okay, what's our immediate response? We've got to have criminal investigation, disaster victim identification, intelligence, forensic response. What we didn't immediately think about was all the families of the victims and what they might now be going through. But that soon dawned on us as soon as we had hundreds of families and loved ones of people that were at that stage missing and unaccounted for descend upon Bali. And of course they were in that early stage of grief, obviously the sense of loss and then the sense of anger, and those early stages of grief that I'm sure many of you in the room are well acquainted with. We were experiencing pretty early on, and it pretty quickly dawned on us, gee, we've missed a big gap here. We're not actually thinking about the families and thinking about the long-term consequences, the long-term scarring, and therefore what is the immediate support we need to wrap around these loved ones and families, because clearly this had been a big event in Australia. It occurred in Bali, but it had a huge emotional impact in Australia, and certainly it did on the families and loved ones and friends of those people that were killed in the blast. So there were police from about 33 different countries. There were over 30 countries who had victims in Bali, represented in Bali being an international destination. And there were British police there who had some experience in this area before. And they said, have you got a family liaison program in place in relation to what's occurred here in Bali? And we just shook our head and said, what's that? You know, what does that look like? You know, so they said, oh, we've got a whole family liaison officer program in London and it's all set up and this is how it works. And they took us through it and we said, gee, we're anything like that here, so we needed to immediately set that up. And we did seek to do that. We put family liaison officers in place all around Australia, as well as in Bali, and we sought to start to provide support, a quick communication, a quick flow of information, which is critically important, as you would well be aware, in the aftermath of disaster, but also support and trying to get referral services organised, trying to provide economic relief in some circumstances, but a whole range of support services available to those family members of victims. And of course, this was the first time we'd tried to do that, so it was a bit lumpy, and some of it was better than others. But and I think if you spoke to family members today, they'd probably give you a bit of a mixed response. Some would say they were well supported, others say they weren't too well supported. And I think it was because of the newness of it and our inexperience at delivering it. But I think what I haven't seen since then is the tracking over time of those families. And I think it'd be a really interesting piece of work to know, okay, the families of those 88 Australians and their extended families, what has been the long-term emotional scarring and how has that affected their lives? Because I think if you went and had a look at it, having read the sort of material that's available now, I'm sure you would see all of those consequences that we see from natural disasters occurring these days. You know, the potential for family violence, the potential for suicide, the self-harm, harming of ones that people love, are all part of that scarring of that emotional landscape. And I'm sure if that work was done now, we would see that in relation to that particular cohort. And I think that makes it particularly important that we learn from our experiences and that we're saying, okay, well, that was 11 years ago in the Bali bombing. Since then, we've had numerous Australian natural disasters, not the least of which, in fact, the most, in some cases, what some people say the most serious of which was the Black Saturday bushfires here in Victoria. We've had the opportunity to improve on those, hopefully improve on those experiences and get better at it. But at the same time, hopefully we've become more able to understand the impact of family violence particularly, but also that emotional scarring on the loved ones and on the families that experience that hardship, and what that does in terms of community harm, community wellbeing, community safety. And after all, if those of you in the emergency services in the room, community safety, community wellbeing is at the heart of what we do. It's why we should be getting up in the morning. is about making our community a safer and better place in which we can raise our families and live our lives. And understanding events like this are critical in trying to achieve that end. Certainly, I think I've been able to sort of point out today the reason why gatherings like this and discussions around these sort of issues are so critical. In a country like Australia, it's a big national landmass. It's open to all sorts of natural disasters, and obviously Steve, who's an expert in counter-terrorism, knows you can have all sorts of man-made disasters and man-made troubles hit a country as well. In Australia, that is prone to those sorts of issues. It's incredibly important that we have amongst the best expertise in the world in terms of managing the recovery, because, as I say, once the flames subside, the floodwaters go away, the emotional scarring on the community is what is left, and we need to be experts at handling that, not just handling the emergency itself. Handling the aftermath is absolutely critical. So, particularly today, I'm really keen to hear what I can of Elaine. One thing when you're filling in for the Chief Commissioner, Elaine, is you've got to go to the next thing, to the next thing, to the next thing, and you find that your opportunity to sit and listen to interesting people is pretty limited. So I will have to shoot off shortly, but I'm keen to at least hear the start of what you've got to say, Elaine, because it's an area that certainly fascinates me and I find immensely interesting, and one I hope that the audience in particular will get something out of, and I'm sure they will. Can I commend you to your work? Could I also, Women's Health from Goulburn North East, can I thank you for again showing this enormous initiative to hold this event, and the emergency services that have got behind it. I think is I think typical of the way in which we're able to network and I think come together as a community on these sorts of issues. So I commend you for that, and I congratulate you on your initiative. I wish you the best for the conference, and it gives me great pleasure to formally open it. Thank you.